The soft flicker of a candlelight illuminates the darkness, casting gentle shadows across the room. The quiet hum of the wind outside adds to the stillness. There's a feeling of tension, as though something important is about to unfold. What happens when a woman dares to speak her mind in a world that demands silence? In a time when speaking out could cost you everything, your reputation, your freedom, even your life, women have always had to fight not just for equality, but for the very right to be heard. But what happens when they refused to stay quiet? When they defied the voices of authority that sought to keep them subjugated? Their punishment was often swift, brutal, and irreversible. They were branded as witches, heretics, and rebels, and one of the darkest punishments they faced, being burned at the stake, their voices extinguished in a blaze of fire. In this video, we'll take you on a journey through history, where women, simply for speaking their minds, became targets of some of the most violent and unjust persecutions. You'll learn about iconic figures like Joan of Arc, whose defiance against the church cost her life. We'll explore the Salem witch trials, where fear and superstition led to the execution of innocent women. But we'll also uncover less stories, hidden chapters of history, where the act of speaking out became an unforgivable sin. What's the connection between silence and power? Why did society fear the voices of women so much? Stay with us as we reveal the shocking truth behind the women who were silenced in the most terrifying way possible. As we peel back the layers of history, you'll discover not only the stories of these brave women, but the lasting impact of their trials. So, if you've ever wondered why women were burned for simply speaking up, or if you're intrigued by history's darkest secrets, this video is for you. But before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Restless Historian. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the untold stories of history. Trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Throughout history, the role of women has often been defined by silence. In many early societies, women were expected to be passive, obedient, and invisible, especially when it came to their voices. The expectations placed upon them were clear. Their opinions were secondary. Their voices should not rise above the murmur of household chores or the soft hum of subservience. Women were primarily seen as caregivers, nurturers, and wives. Their value linked to their ability to maintain the home and raise children. In a world where strength was measured by loudness, both figuratively and literally, women were silenced by the very structure of the societies they lived in. In ancient civilizations, the silence of women was enforced not only by societal norms, but by the emerging structures of patriarchy. Patriarchy, as an entrenched system, began to take hold. As civilizations grew more complex, with the rise of agriculture and the establishment of property, the male role in societies became increasingly central. Men became the primary providers, warriors, and leaders. Women's roles, meanwhile, were confined to the home and hearth, with their participation in public life restricted to the private spheres of family and household. The male-dominated hierarchy established during this period was reflected in both political and religious institutions. The notion that men should lead and that women should follow was written into the very fabric of early societies. Religious and cultural traditions reinforced these gender roles, positioning women as the lesser sex, often described as subordinate and fragile. Ancient texts, from Greek philosophers to religious scriptures, spoke of women as inherently weaker and therefore in need of guidance. Even the gods in many mythologies, such as those in Greece or Mesopotamia, were predominantly male, reinforcing the idea of male superiority. This patriarchal system dictated everything from politics to family dynamics, where women's voices were not just ignored, but actively suppressed. Women's silence was not just expected but deeply entrenched in the laws and customs of ancient societies. In ancient Greece, for example, women had very few legal rights. They were considered under the guardianship of their father or husband, and their ability to participate in any form of public discourse was strictly limited. Women were not allowed to participate in the democratic assemblies, nor could they engage in any form of public speaking or decision. Their role was to stay within the confines of the home, where their primary duty was to bear and raise children and ensure that their husbands were well cared for. In this context, the female voice was not just unwelcome, it was dangerous. This idea of danger surrounding women's voices carried over into later periods of history. As societies grew more complex, the fear of women speaking up became more deeply embedded. Women's voices, it seemed, had the power to disrupt the carefully constructed order of things. Whether it was a woman questioning a law, speaking out against injustice, or simply expressing an opinion, her voice was perceived as a threat. In medieval and early modern Europe, women who dared to step outside their designated roles often faced harsh consequences. The fear of the female voice was inextricably tied to the fear of social disorder. In many cultures, the idea that women should remain silent was not just a cultural expectation, but a deeply held belief that their speech could be dangerous. The very act of a woman speaking in a way that deviated from the norm was seen as an affront to the established order. Her voice was a symbol of rebellion against the social structures that had been carefully established for centuries, and this was not just a fear of noise, it was a fear of chaos. The idea was that women's voices could unbalance society, challenge authority, and question long-held beliefs. A woman's voice wasn't just a matter of personal expression. It was a symbol of potential insurrection, of the dismantling of societal order. This perception of the female voice as dangerous was particularly pronounced in the context of religion. In many early societies, religious leaders and institutions wielded immense power, and the church was an enforcer of social norms. Women were often excluded from positions of authority within religious structures, and any attempt by them to speak out or question the teachings of the church was met with resistance. In some cases, women who did speak up were labeled as witches or heretics, punished for what was seen as a transgression of divine law. These women were often accused of having a voice that was not only socially unacceptable, but also spiritually corrupt. In these contexts, their voices were considered dangerous because they threatened the sanctity of the established religious order. The connection between women's speech and social disorder became particularly pronounced during times of political upheaval or religious fervor, when the established order was threatened, whether by a rebellion, a new religious movement, or shifting political tides. The voices of women were often among the first to be silenced. In these times of instability, the fear of disorder grew stronger, and any form of defiances from women was seen as a potential catalyst for chaos. A woman's voice could call attention to the injustices within society, to the flaws in governance, or to the inequality embedded within the system. The simple act of questioning the status quo was, in itself, seen as a revolutionary act. This fear of female speech can also be seen in the way that women were punished for stepping out of line. In medieval Europe, women who spoke too openly or who refused to conform to societal expectations were often accused of witchcraft. The burning at the stake became one of the most infamous methods of silencing women. A woman could be accused of witchcraft simply for expressing an opinion that challenged the norm, whether that opinion was about religion, politics, or gender roles. The fear surrounding these women was not just about the content of their speech. It was about the possibility that their words could incite others to question their own place in society in the colonial era, particularly in places like Salem, Massachusetts. This fear intensified. The Salem witch trials were driven by a deep-seated belief that women who spoke out of turn were not only socially dangerous, but spiritually threatening. Fear and superstition ran rampant, and women were blamed for a host of societal problems, from crop failures to illnesses. The trials were a direct response to women who were perceived to be stepping outside the bounds of their prescribed roles. Women who were outspoken, independent, or who had unconventional ideas were seen as a threat to the community's moral and social fabric. The fear of women's voices was not only based on the belief that women were naturally weak, but also on the perception that their voices carried a hidden, subversive power. In a society built on rigid hierarchies, the very idea of a woman speaking freely was seen as a destabilizing force. She was not just an individual with a right to express her thoughts. She was a symbol of rebellion against the structure that governed society. In this way, women's speech was tied to the fear of losing control, of inviting chaos, and of disrupting the social order that had been in place for centuries. As we look back through history, the link between a woman's voice and social disorder becomes clear. The fear of female speech was not just a result of cultural norms, but was deeply embedded in the structures of power, religion, and politics. The silence of women was a tool of control, one that was reinforced through centuries of social, legal, and religious structures. When women broke free from that silence when they spoke out, they were not just challenging the norms of their time, but threatening the very systems that had kept them silent for so long. In the early centuries of our common era, the rise of religious authority, particularly the spread of Christianity across Europe, solidified a powerful control over all aspects of life, including women's voices. The Church did not simply influence religious belief, it shaped the very structure of society, particularly through its control over morality, behavior, and social order. In a world governed by faith, the voice of a woman could become not only disruptive, but dangerous, often seen as a threat to the harmony and sanctity of the Christian way of life. Christianity's influence on Western civilization reached far beyond spiritual teachings. It embedded itself into the laws, the customs, and even the very idea of what was acceptable behavior. The Bible, as the cornerstone of Christian belief, became a blueprint not only for personal salvation, but also for social order. And in this order, women were often relegated to positions of passivity and subordination. The voices of women were seen as unnecessary and even dangerous, particularly if they challenged the status quo. To speak freely or loudly was to transgress the boundaries that had been carefully laid out by centuries of theological thought. The rise of Christian religious authority also meant that the Church became an unyielding force in shaping what was deemed acceptable. In Christian doctrine, women were often portrayed as weaker vessels, prone to sin and temptation. The story of Eve in the book of Genesis, who was tempted by the serpent and led Adam into sin, served as a foundational narrative that reinforced the idea of women's inherent weakness and their susceptibility to moral failings. This narrative carried significant weight throughout history and had profound implications for the social standing of women. Women were not only viewed as morally inferior, but also as more prone to heresy, witchcraft, and disorder. The fear of female speech grew as the Church's control over European society expanded. Women were seen as not only morally weaker, but also more susceptible to sin because of their supposed natural connection to evil. The concept of speaking out against the Church, its doctrines, or its power could easily lead to accusations of heresy. To speak openly, to express an opinion contrary to the established order, was a direct challenge to the authority of the Church. The Church's influence extended well beyond spiritual matters. It became an institution of power, control, and political might. Speaking out was not just an act of individual dissent, was a direct threat to the carefully maintained authority of the religious establishment. Women who questioned the established order, who expressed ideas that seemed unorthodox or rebellious, were often accused of being agents of chaos, of spreading disorder or heresy. It was within this framework that women began to be associated with witchcraft. The very idea of a woman speaking out against male-dominated authority was seen as a dangerous act. Women's voices, particularly those that challenged authority, were not just heard, they were feared. The association between speaking out and being accused of witchcraft or heresy was particularly pronounced during the height of the Inquisition. In a world where religious conformity was seen as essential to social stability, any deviation from orthodoxy was an act of defiance. Women, often seen as more susceptible to the powers of darkness, were especially vulnerable to such accusations. The idea of witchcraft was not just limited to magic or the supernatural, it was also seen as a form of resistance. A woman who spoke too freely, who expressed too many ideas, or who seemed too independent, could easily be labeled as a witch. The link between speaking out and being accused of witchcraft was stark and terrifying. The very act of expressing an opinion could lead to a woman being branded as a witch. Speaking against the Church, the state, or the established moral order could be interpreted as an act of rebellion, and rebellion was viewed as the work of the devil. Those who resisted the dominant order were considered to be part of a larger, more sinister conspiracy in the minds of many. Speaking out was not merely a personal act, was evidence of a woman's alliance with dark forces in the early modern period, particularly during the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. The fear of witchcraft and heresy reached a fever pitch. The religious authorities, emboldened by the power of the Church, sought to root out any trace of dissent, especially among women. This fear was most visibly manifested in the countless trials and executions of women accused of witchcraft. These women were often not powerful, not influential in any traditional sense. They were simple women, often poor, who had no recourse but to express themselves in a society that demanded silence. Their voices were their rebellion. Their defiance was viewed as a threat to the very order of the world. One of the most significant ways women were accused of witchcraft was through their defiance of gender expectations. Women who spoke too freely, who stepped outside their prescribed roles, were seen as transgressors. The Church and the state had set the boundaries of acceptable behavior for women, and when women crossed those lines, whether by speaking out, by questioning the authorities, or by expressing independent thought, they were marked as witches. A woman who rejected the notion of silence or obedience was perceived as rejecting the divine order itself. Her voice, in this context, was a powerful force of disruption that needed to be silenced. The witch hunts that ravaged Europe and the American colonies in the late medieval and early modern periods were driven by these fears. The specter of women challenging religious and social norms was one of the most terrifying concepts of the era. Women were seen as particularly dangerous because of the belief that their voices could manipulate or corrupt the world around them. A woman who spoke up for herself, who dared to question the powers that be, was immediately suspicious. She was not simply exercising her right to speak, she was shaking the foundations of the world as it had been built. The infamous witch trials of Salem in the late 17th century serve as one of the most glaring examples of how a woman's defiance, her very act of speaking her mind, could be twisted into something far more sinister. In Salem, a combination of fear, superstition, and religious fervor created a perfect storm for mass hysteria. Women who expressed any form of dissent were accused of witchcraft. Their speech, whether it was a direct challenge to authority or simply a questioning of the status quo, was viewed as a dangerous act. The idea that these women were agents of disorder, witches who threatened the fabric of society, became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The accusations quickly spiraled out of control, with innocent women sent to their deaths, their voices silenced forever. The fear of women speaking out was not just a matter of cultural tradition or social control. It was deeply tied to the broader religious and political landscape. The Church, in its quest to maintain its authority, viewed any challenge to its power as a threat to the very fabric of society. Women, often the most vulnerable in these systems of power, were the first targets. Their voices were not just dangerous because they were loud, they were dangerous because they held the potential to bring down the entire system of control that had been carefully constructed over centuries. This fear, deeply embedded in the religious and political fabric of Europe, continued to haunt societies for centuries. The specter of witchcraft, of heresy, of a woman's voice stirring rebellion, remained a powerful force. And as history shows, the consequences of a woman speaking out could be dire, often ending in punishment, and sometimes in death. The origins of the witch hunts that swept through Europe and colonial America are deeply intertwined with the religious, cultural, and social dynamics of the times. These hunts did not arise from a single cause, but were the product of centuries of belief, fear, and control, all converging at a moment in history when the conditions were ripe for mass hysteria and widespread persecution, the roots of which hunts can be traced back to the Middle Ages in Europe, a time when religion, particularly Christianity, held immense sway over nearly every aspect of life. Christianity's view of the world was shaped by the idea of good versus evil, light versus darkness, and salvation versus damnation. This dualistic view of the world made it easy to categorize people as either righteous or sinful, and once people were labeled as sinful, their punishment was often severe. In this worldview, women were particularly vulnerable because they were seen as the weaker sex, more susceptible to the temptations of the devil. The rise of the Christian Church in medieval Europe helped codify these ideas. As the Church gained power, it took on the responsibility of policing both the body and soul, enforcing religious orthodoxy and punishing those who were perceived as deviating from the accepted norms. The notion of witchcraft, as it was understood at the time, became a particularly useful tool for the Church to maintain control over society. It was not just a crime against God, but a crime against the social order itself, and women, who were already seen as morally weaker and more susceptible to temptation, were more frequently accused of being in league with the devil. The idea of witches and witchcraft was not new, but its association with women and its use as a tool of social control became more pronounced as the power of the Church grew. The term, which became synonymous with heresy, with rebellion, and with the threat of chaos, To be accused of witchcraft was not just to be accused of magic, it was to be accused of challenging the very fabric of society. Women, as the primary caretakers of family and community life, were perceived as having the ability to disrupt the delicate balance of the social order. When a woman was accused of witchcraft, it was often because she had done something that went against the established norms, whether it was questioning the status quo, behaving outside the prescribed gender roles, or challenging the authority of the church or the state. By the time of the Renaissance and into the early modern period, the fear of witchcraft had become widespread. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation in the 16th century created an environment of intense religious and political turmoil. Religious reformers sought to root out heresy, and the Catholic Church, feeling the threat to its power, began to aggressively pursue witches as part of its efforts to maintain control. The result was the proliferation of witch hunts, first in Europe and later in colonial America. The conditions for the witch hunts in Europe were multifaceted. Social upheaval, including wars, famines, and plagues, created a climate of fear and uncertainty. People were struggling to make sense of a world that seemed increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. The Catholic Church and Protestant reformers capitalized on this fear by framing witchcraft as an existential threat to the Christian world. Witch hunts became a way to channel the collective anxiety of a society in crisis. Those who were accused of witchcraft often became scapegoats for societal ills that no one could explain, whether it was a bad harvest, a deadly disease, or the death of a loved one. The fear of witches became a tool for the authorities to consolidate power, to distract from other social or political problems, and to maintain control over the masses. In colonial America, the witch hunts were similarly influenced by fear and religion, but they were also shaped by the specific conditions of early colonial life. Puritan settlers in New England were particularly prone to witchcraft paranoia, largely due to their strict religious beliefs and their belief that the devil was constantly working to undermine their society. The Puritans saw their communities as fragile and in constant danger of being corrupted by evil forces. The Salem witch trials of 1692, one of the most infamous examples of witch hunts in colonial America, were fueled by this religious fervor, but also by social tensions within the community. Fear of the devil and the belief in the supernatural created an atmosphere where accusations of witchcraft could quickly spiral out of control, and women, particularly those who were seen as outsiders or who did not conform to social norms, were easy targets. Women were disproportionately targeted in these witch hunts, and this was not a coincidence. The gender dynamics of the time played a significant role in how women were perceived and treated. In medieval and early modern Europe, women were often seen as weaker, more emotional, and more susceptible to temptation than men. This perception was rooted in religious and cultural beliefs that women were inherently flawed, with the idea that they were more likely to fall prey to the devil's influence. The biblical story of Eve, who was tempted by the serpent and led Adam astray, became a foundational narrative that framed women as more susceptible to sin. Because of this view of women as morally weaker, they were more frequently associated with witchcraft and were seen as more likely to engage in dark practices. The social roles assigned to women also made them easy scapegoats in times of crisis. Women were primarily responsible for domestic duties, including child rearing, food preparation, and healthcare. If something went wrong in the community, whether it was a sudden illness, a failed crop, or a death, women were often blamed. Because women were seen as the caretakers of the community Any failure in this role could be seen as evidence of witchcraft. Women who were unmarried, widowed, or who lived on the fringes of society were often viewed with suspicion. They were seen as threatening to the established order, and their nonconformity made them easy targets for witch hunts. The intersection of gender, religion, and power further exacerbated the persecution of women during the witch hunts. The social order of the time was constructed in such a way that men held power in both religious and political spheres, and women were expected to submit to their authority. When a woman stepped outside of these boundaries by speaking out, by refusing to obey, or by simply existing in a way that challenged the norm, she became a threat to the power structures that controlled society. Witchcraft accusations often carried with them political and social implications. By accusing a woman of witchcraft, the authorities could silence her, discredit her, and remove her from the public sphere. It was a way to reinforce male authority and suppress any attempts by women to challenge the social order. The witch hunts were also shaped by the broader context of power and control. The church and the state were both deeply invested in maintaining control over people's lives, and women, as the most vulnerable members of society, were the easiest to control through fear. Witchcraft accusations often became a tool of political and social repression, used to maintain power and to eliminate those who were perceived as threats. Whether it was the Catholic Inquisition in Europe or the Puritan trials in Salem, the persecution of women was a way to reinforce patriarchal control and prevent any challenge to the established order. The widespread belief in witchcraft and the persecution of women who were accused of practicing it reflected the broader dynamics of fear, control, and gender inequality that marked these periods in history. Women who defied social norms, questioned authority, or lived outside the established order became targets for persecution, their voices silenced by the very forces that sought to maintain the status quo. In this context, witch hunts were not just about supernatural beliefs, they were about power, control, and the fear of female agency. Women, in their defiance and independence, were seen as threats to the existing social, religious, and political structures, and as such, they became the primary victims of one of the darkest chapters in history. Joan of Arc, one of history's most iconic and enduring figures, was a woman whose very existence challenged the conventions of her time. Born in 1412 in the small village of Domremy, France, Joan was a peasant girl who, by sheer will and conviction, rose to become one of the most powerful and influential military leaders of the 100 Years' War. Her journey from humble beginnings to military leader was not only unprecedented, it defied the gender norms and societal expectations of the time, where leadership in warfare was strictly a male domain. But Joan's spirit, determination, and faith gave her the courage to rise above these constraints and become a symbol of resistance, national pride, and divine purpose. Joan's story is not one of a woman quietly accepting the roles assigned to her by society. On the contrary, she demonstrated the kind of courage and defiance that was rare for a woman in the 15th century. She was not simply a figure who followed the paths laid out for women, but someone who forged her own way, one that led her into the heart of political and military leadership. She was motivated by what she believed was a divine calling. At the age of 13, she began experiencing visions and hearing voices, which she believed were sent by Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These voices instructed her to support Charles VII, the Dauphin heir to the French throne, and to help him reclaim his rightful place as King of France, a country gripped by civil war and under English occupation. Joan's rise as a military leader in such a male-dominated society is nothing short of remarkable. Women in the 15th century, particularly in the context of medieval warfare, had little to no public power. The idea of a young, unarmed girl leading an army was unthinkable. Yet, Joan's faith and resolve drove her to convince Charles VII that she was divinely chosen to lead France to victory. Despite initial skepticism from the military leaders, Joan managed to persuade Charles to give her command over an army, and in 1429 she led the French forces to lift the siege of Orleans, a turning point in the 100 Years' War. Her leadership and courage inspired the French army and re-energized the morale of the people. Joan, a simple peasant girl, had taken on the mantle of a military leader, rallying troops and earning the respect of men who had long held the reins of power. Joan's rise to prominence, however, came at a great cost. Her defiance of gender norms and her audacious assumption of power made her a target of both political and religious authorities. She was a woman, yes, but she was also an unparalleled force on the battlefield. Her ability to inspire men, her strategic insight, and her unwavering faith all stood in stark contrast to the expectations of women at the time. The very fact that she was leading an army in the 15th century was enough to raise suspicion and hostility. It was not just Joan's actions that would bring about her trial and eventual execution, but her very existence as a woman who had broken the mold and assumed a position of power that was typically reserved for men. In 1430, after several years of military success, Joan was captured by the Burgundians, allies of the English, during a military campaign. She was handed over to the English, who saw her as not only a military threat, but a symbol of French resistance. They quickly set in motion a plan to discredit her and strip her of the power and influence she had gained. The English and their allies were determined to rid themselves of this young woman who had defied all odds and led the French toward victory. To do so, they would use every tool at their disposal: religious authority, political power, and public perception. Joan was put on trial in 1431 in Rouen, under the authority of the English bishop Pierre Couchon. The charges brought against her were manifold, but they all stemmed from the same source: the perceived threat she posed to the established political and religious order. She was accused of witchcraft, heresy, and cross-dressing, the latter charge arising from her wearing men's military attire, which was a stark violation of the gender norms of the time. The accusations against Joan were not based on any tangible evidence of wrongdoing, but were instead rooted in the fear and power dynamics of a society that had no place for a woman in her position. Her trial was a sham designed to discredit her and strip her of her power. Joan was interrogated relentlessly, and her interrogators sought to break her spirit and force her to recant her beliefs. They focused on her visions, which she had claimed were messages from God, and used them to accuse her of heresy. Joan's claim to be divinely inspired was dangerous because it undermined the religious authority of the Church and the political authority of the English. The trial was politically motivated from the start, and its outcome was a foregone conclusion. Joan's defiance of the norms of gender and power could not be tolerated by the authorities, so they used her trial to publicly destroy her. One of the most controversial aspects of Joan's trial was the charge of cross-dressing. Joan had worn men's clothing while leading her troops, and this act was seen as a direct affront to the social order. Women were expected to dress in a manner that reflected their subordinate status, and Joan's rejection of this expectation was seen as a direct challenge to the established gender roles. Her decision to wear men's clothes, which was partly for practical reasons as she led an army, was framed by her accusers as a deliberate act of rebellion, an expression of her rejection of the norms that governed women's behavior. It was, in their eyes, proof of her deviance. The trial concluded with a sentence of death by burning at the stake. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was executed in Rouen at the age of 19. Her death, however, did not mark the end of her influence. Instead, her martyrdom only strengthened her legacy. In the years following her execution, her reputation grew, and she was seen by many as a martyr who had died for her faith and for her country. Her trial and death made her a symbol of resistance, not only against the English, but against the power structures that sought to silence her. Joan's legacy was further cemented in the decades following her death. In 1456, a posthumous retrial, ordered by Pope Calixtus III, declared her innocent of all charges. Acknowledging the unjust nature of her trial and execution, Joan's canonization as a saint in 1920 further solidified her place in history as a symbol of courage, defiance, and faith. Her life and martyrdom became a powerful reminder of the price of standing up against oppression and the forces of conformity. Joan's impact on history is undeniable. Her defiance, both in life and in death, has inspired generations of people, men and women alike, who see in her story a call to challenge the status quo and to fight for what they believe in. Her military leadership, her faith, and her courage continue to serve as a powerful example of the strength of the human spirit. Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who defied the expectations of her time, has become a symbol of empowerment, of resistance, and of the transformative power of believing in something greater than oneself. Her spirit, as much as her actions, continues to echo through the ages. The Salem witch trials, which took place in 1692 in colonial Massachusetts, remain one of the most infamous episodes of mass hysteria in history. The trials were not merely a set of isolated events, but a culmination of religious, social, and political factors that created an environment where fear, superstition, and suspicion flourished. The town of Salem, along with other nearby Puritan communities, was a place where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was thin, and belief in the unseen was an integral part of daily life. Superstition and fear of the devil were pervasive, and these elements played a significant role in shaping the trials that would engulf the community. In the late 17th century, colonial America was a place where religion, particularly Puritanism, held tremendous power. Puritan communities, such as Salem, were tightly knit, with a strict moral code that governed every aspect of life. The Puritans believed in the literal existence of good and evil, with every event in the world viewed through the lens of this spiritual duality. For them, the devil was an ever-present force, lurking behind every misfortune, illness, or bad harvest. The belief that witches were in league with the devil was deeply ingrained in the Puritan worldview. The mere thought of witchcraft was enough to invoke fear and panic, and when things went wrong, whether due to disease, death, or social conflict, the devil was often blamed. The belief in the supernatural had a hold on the collective psyche, and it wasn't difficult for people to begin seeing witchcraft behind every problem. But the climate of fear that permeated Salem wasn't just about supernatural beliefs. It was also a product of social and political pressures. Puritan communities were under constant stress, both internally and externally. Salem, in particular, was facing a series of challenges. There were disputes over land, political tensions, and a population that had been unsettled by recent wars and Indian raids. The spectre of witchcraft offered a convenient explanation for the turmoil. and the trial process became a way to channel and resolve these anxieties. It wasn't just that people believed in witchcraft. They were looking for someone to blame, someone to accuse of bringing chaos to their lives. In a society as tight-knit and insular as Salem, that someone was often a woman who was perceived as different, defiant, or outside the community's norms. At the heart of the trials were women who, for various reasons, became scapegoats for the town's anxieties. The gender dynamics of the time played a significant role in how women were viewed, particularly in relation to the witch trials. In Puritan society, women were expected to be obedient, modest, and pious. Any deviation from these norms could be seen as suspicious, and women who were perceived as out of place were often the ones accused of witchcraft. Puritan religious leaders viewed women as especially vulnerable to the devil's influence. The doctrine of original sin and the fall of Eve in the Garden of Eden had long cast women as morally weaker and more susceptible to temptation. Thus, women who were outspoken, independent, or who didn't fit into the expected roles of wives and mothers became easy targets for suspicion. The trial of Tituba, the enslaved woman from the Caribbean, is often considered the spark that ignited the Salem witch trials. Tituba, who lived in the household of Reverend Samuel Perris, was one of the first people to be accused of witchcraft. The accusations against her came after a group of young girls in Salem Village began to display strange behaviors, convulsions, fits, and claims of being possessed. In the highly charged religious environment of the time, these symptoms were interpreted as signs of witchcraft. Tituba, along with Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, was arrested and interrogated. During her trial, Tituba confessed to being a witch, citing visions of the devil and describing her alleged pact with him. Her confession, whether coerced or not, set in motion a wave of accusations that would engulf the community. Tituba's confession was significant because it validated the fears that the people of Salem had been harboring. Her statements fueled the hysteria, and her testimony served as the justification for further accusations. Tituba's role in the trials is a reflection of the racial and social dynamics of the time. As a woman of African and indigenous descent, she occupied the lowest rungs of Salem's social ladder. Tituba's status as a slave, her foreign background, and her marginalized position made her an ideal target for suspicion. In a society where women were already vulnerable, those who were outside the mainstream social order, whether due to race, class, or behavior, were especially at risk of being labeled as witches. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, two other women accused of witchcraft, also reflect the intersection of gender and societal expectations. Sarah Good was a poor, homeless woman who was known to beg for food and often caused trouble in the community. Her social standing made her an easy target, as she was seen as a nuisance and a threat to the established order. Sarah Osborne, on the other hand, was an elderly woman who had been living outside the norms of the community for several years. She had married a man who had been previously married to another woman, and her unconventional behavior in the eyes of the Puritans made her a prime suspect in the witch hunts. Both women, like Tituba, were vulnerable because they did not conform to the rigid social and religious norms that governed Salem society. The accusations against these women were not based on any tangible evidence of witchcraft. Rather, they were based on a complex combination of fear, suspicion, and social pressure. The trials were a way for the community to address its collective anxieties, but they were also a mechanism for reinforcing the patriarchal structures that governed Salem's social order. In Puritan society, Women were expected to submit to male authority, whether that came from husbands, fathers, or religious leaders. Women who were seen as defiant or who stepped outside their prescribed roles were a direct challenge to that authority. The Salem witch trials allowed the male-dominated society to reassert its control, and by accusing women of witchcraft, they were effectively silencing them and stripping them of any agency they had. Men, particularly religious and political leaders, played a central role in the trials. Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister whose daughter was one of the first to display the symptoms of possession, was a key figure in the initial stages of the trials. His involvement in the accusations and the trial process highlights the intersection of religion, politics, and gender. Puritan ministers like Parris had significant power in Salem, and their authority was often unquestioned. The witch trials allowed them to exercise that power in a very direct and visible way. The role of men in the trials also extended to the judges and magistrates who presided over the proceedings. Men like Judge Samuel Sewell and Judge William Stoughton were responsible for determining the guilt or innocence of the accused, and their decisions were often influenced by religious fervor and the belief in the absolute authority of the church. These men were the ones who sentenced women to death. Despite the lack of evidence and the clear signs of manipulation and coercion within the trial process, the pressure on women to conform in Salem was immense. The Puritan belief in predestination meant that individuals were constantly scrutinizing one another's behavior to ensure that they were living according to the strict moral code of the community. Women, in particular, were expected to maintain a facade of piety and submission. Women who were seen as outspoken, assertive, or in any way outside the accepted norms of behavior were perceived as a threat. This created an environment in which women were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, as they were seen not only as morally inferior, but also as inherently more likely to fall victim to the devil's influence. The Salem witch trials were a tragic and terrifying example of how fear, superstition, and societal pressure could result in the destruction of innocent lives. The women who were accused, including Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, were not the only victims. The hysteria that swept through Salem led to the deaths of 20 people, most of them women, and the imprisonment of many more. The trials themselves were a reflection of the ways in which gender, religion, and power intersected to create a society where women were seen as both morally inferior and politically expendable. In the end, the Salem witch trials were a stark reminder of how easily mass hysteria could be fueled by fear and how vulnerable women were in a society that denied them both agency and justice. Throughout history, the dynamics of gender have profoundly influenced the way women were treated when they spoke out, particularly in societies where patriarchal structures were deeply ingrained. In many of these societies, women were not seen as individuals with agency and autonomy, but rather as property either of their fathers, husbands, or society at large. This perception of women as subordinates created an environment where any attempt by women to step beyond the rigidly defined roles they were assigned was not only seen as a threat to social order, but often as a challenge to the very foundations of power that men held. The silencing of women's voices, therefore, was not just about quelling dissent, it was about preserving the gendered power structures that allowed men to dominate both the public and private spheres. In many cultures, women were expected to remain passive, obedient, and silent. They were conditioned to prioritize their roles as wives, mothers, and caretakers, all within the confines of their homes. This set the stage for the treatment of women who did not conform to these roles. When women spoke out, whether it was to challenge social norms, question political authority, or simply express an opinion, it was often perceived as a direct violation of their expected place in society. To speak out was to step beyond the boundaries of propriety and authority, and in a deeply patriarchal world, that could have dangerous consequences. In societies where men held almost all the power, women who spoke out were often labeled as unnatural, rebellious, or even mentally unstable. These reactions were rooted in the perception of women as objects to be controlled, and the idea that their voices were not their own, but instead a reflection of the wills of the men who controlled them. Women were considered incapable of making sound decisions or rational arguments in the public sphere, as their primary role was seen as nurturing and maintaining the home. Speaking in public, especially when it went against the established norms or structures, was seen as an affront to this carefully constructed order. This idea of women as property rather than as autonomous individuals has its roots in both ancient legal systems and religious teachings. In many societies, marriage was viewed as a transaction between men, with women being exchanged as property. Women's rights, or lack thereof, were defined by their relationship to the men in their lives. In Roman law, for example, a woman's legal existence was often subsumed under her father or husband's authority. She had little control over her own finances, her own body, or even her personal beliefs. In the English common law, the doctrine of coverture declared that a woman's legal identity was merged with that of her husband upon marriage, rendering her legally incapable of owning property or entering into contracts. This deeply entrenched the idea of women as property was mirrored in many parts of the world and underpinned much of the cultural and legal silencing of women's voices. As such, when women spoke out in ways that disrupted the status quo, whether politically, socially, or personally, they were often met with suspicion, hostility, and repression. A woman who expressed independent thoughts or who dared to critique authority was seen as stepping out of line with the accepted norms. These actions were viewed as an attempt to assert control over a domain that was considered by default. In this context, a woman's speech could be interpreted not just as personal expression, but as an act of defiance against the male-controlled social order. It was this defiance that made women's voices so dangerous, as they were believed to have the power to incite rebellion and to upend the established hierarchy. This fear of women's voices is particularly evident when looking at the cultural and legal mechanisms used to silence them. Historically, legal systems have been used as tools to suppress women's speech and to limit their ability to participate in the political and social discourse of their societies. Laws, both formal and informal, restricted women's rights to free speech, access to education, and participation in public affairs. In many countries, women were excluded from voting, holding office, or engaging in legal debates. Even the act of speaking publicly or challenging authority was, at times, considered a punishable offense. For example, in ancient Athens, women were not allowed to participate in public life. The democratic system that granted men the right to vote and speak in the assembly completely excluded women from any form of political expression. Women were confined to the domestic sphere, their voices only heard in private circles. In many Western societies during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, women were similarly excluded from education, and their ability to speak or write in public was severely limited. Any woman who stepped outside the domestic sphere, whether in the public space or through writing, was often met with scorn or derision. Religious institutions too, played a significant role in silencing women's voices. In many religious traditions, women were portrayed as spiritually inferior to men, and their roles within religious life were relegated to that of support and service. The Christian Church, for instance, held that women were not permitted to speak or take positions of authority in the religious sphere. The Apostle Paul's writings in the New Testament were often interpreted to mean that women should be silent in church, and that they should be submissive to men in all aspects of life. This religious control over women's voices was reflected in the widespread belief that a woman's opinion was irrelevant in matters of spiritual, political, or social importance. The process of silencing women was not just an institutionalized or legal mechanism, it was also deeply embedded in cultural norms and social expectations. In many societies, women who spoke out were labeled as unfeminine, hysterical, or crazy. The cultural expectation was that women should be calm, gentle, and demure, traits that were valued in the private sphere, but that had little place in the public or political arenas. When women voiced their opinions, particularly in ways that challenged the status quo, they were often dismissed as irrational or emotionally driven. Their arguments were seen as unworthy of consideration because they were presumed to lack the rationality or objectivity that men were thought to possess. In some cases, the act of speaking out was seen as a threat to the very fabric of society. Women who defied gender norms and demanded the right to speak were often viewed as rebels or subversives, and their actions were seen as disruptive to social order. This fear of women's independence and free speech is evident in the witch hunts, the trials of heretics, and the persecution of women who sought to claim a voice in the public sphere. When women spoke out against the church, the state, or other power structures, they were often punished in ways that silenced them permanently. The burning of women at the stake, the execution of outspoken feminists and political dissidents, and the criminalization of women's speech were all methods used to curb women's agency and to ensure that their voices were not heard in the public discourse. The role of gender in the persecution of women who spoke out can also be seen in the way women were treated during the witch trials. In these trials, women were accused of witchcraft and heresy not just for practicing magical rites, but for stepping outside the norms of female behavior. Women who were outspoken, who displayed independence, or who simply acted in ways that challenged the authority of men were often labeled as witches. The social, cultural, and legal structures of the time were designed to silence these women, to reinforce the idea that women's voices were dangerous, and to ensure that they remained obedient and submissive. Over time, the cultural and legal mechanisms that silenced women's voices began to face challenges. Feminist movements, the rise of education for women, and legal reforms slowly shifted the balance of power. Women's voices, once suppressed and ignored, began to find platforms for expression. However, the deeply entrenched notions of women as property, their voices as unwelcome in public discourse, and their independence as a threat to order continued to shape the ways women were treated in society. The battle for women's freedom of speech, for their right to be heard, remains a struggle that has unfolded over centuries, one that is still ongoing in many parts of the world today. The control over women's voices has always been a means of controlling their power. When women are denied the right to speak, they are also denied the ability to shape their own destinies, to engage in social and political discourse, and to contribute to the shaping of society itself. Silencing women has been one of the most effective ways of maintaining patriarchal power dynamics and ensuring that women remain subjugated to male authority. Yet, As history has shown, women's voices, once silenced, have always found a way to speak again, more powerful and more determined than ever before. Throughout history, women who dared to speak out against societal norms or challenge authority often faced severe, life-altering consequences. Their punishment was often not just about silencing them, but about sending a message to society at large, one that reinforced the belief that women, particularly those who defied their prescribed roles, should be controlled and subjugated. In many societies, punishments for defiance ranged from imprisonment to public humiliation, and the most extreme execution by burning, beheading, or other forms of capital punishment. These punishments were not just legal tools. They were symbolic acts meant to preserve the patriarchal order and to deter other women from voicing their dissent. The burning of women at the stake, in particular, stands out as one of the most brutal and public forms of punishment for those who spoke out. Historically, this punishment was most notably associated with accusations of witchcraft, heresy, or political rebellion crimes that were often closely linked to women's voices being perceived as a threat. The act of burning a woman alive was meant to erase her voice, to permanently silence her, and to display the consequences of challenging societal norms. It also served to reinforce the idea that women's words and actions, particularly when they were considered transgressive, were inherently dangerous. In medieval and early modern Europe, the burning at the stake was used for various offenses, but it was disproportionately applied to women. The Church, in its role as both a spiritual and political authority, viewed women who defied religious and social expectations as agents of disorder. The punishment of burning was often reserved for women accused of witchcraft or heresy, women who were believed to have strayed from the path of religious and social conformity. The public nature of the punishment was meant to act as both a spectacle and a warning, a means of both eliminating the so-called threat and reminding others of the power of the state and the church. Women accused of witchcraft were often seen as embodiments of evil, and their executions were intended to purge society of the corrupting influence of their speech and behavior. Women who spoke out against the church, or who were seen as challenging the natural order by expressing independent thoughts, were often labeled as witches. Accusations could be leveled against women for a variety of reasons, many of which had little to do with actual wrongdoing. In times of crisis, such as crop failures or outbreaks of disease, communities would search for a scapegoat, and women were frequently chosen. In many cases, these women were simply outspoken or had a reputation for defying the norm, making them easy targets for accusations of witchcraft. The practice of burning women at the stake was a powerful tool of control and intimidation. In the minds of the authorities, these executions were necessary to maintain order and preserve the purity of the community. Witchcraft, heresy, and defiance were seen as threats, not just to religious belief, but to social cohesion itself. By executing women in such a violent and public manner, authorities were sending a clear message that women who stepped outside the prescribed boundaries of behavior would face dire consequences. It was a way of ensuring that women remained silent, obedient, and within the confines of socially acceptable roles. To speak out was to risk annihilation. One of the most famous and tragic examples of this kind of punishment is the case of Joan of Arc. In the early 15th century, Joan rose to prominence as a military leader in France, inspiring her countrymen in their fight against the English during the 100 Years' War. She claimed to be acting on divine guidance, believing she was chosen by God to lead France to victory. Despite her success on the battlefield, Joan's defiance of the established gender roles and her claim to divine Inspiration led to her capture by the English. She was put on trial for charges including heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing, as she had worn men's military attire. The trial was politically motivated, aiming to discredit her influence and undermine her power. Joan was found guilty of heresy and witchcraft, and in 1431, at the age of 19, she was executed by burning at the stake in Rouen, France. Her punishment was not just about silencing her hit, it was about destroying the symbol of her defiance. Joan's execution was meant to erase her from history, to remove the threat she posed to both the English and to the established gender and religious norms. Yet, despite her brutal death, Joan's legacy only grew in the years that followed. She became a martyr, a symbol of courage and resistance. Her death did not silence her. It amplified her voice and further cemented her place in history. Joan of Arc's case is not unique. Throughout history, countless women were punished for simply speaking out, expressing their thoughts, or stepping beyond the limits of what was considered acceptable for their gender. Many of these women were executed, their deaths often seen as a necessary measure to preserve societal order. In addition to burning at the stake, women were also punished through imprisonment, torture, and beheading. The severity of these punishments reflected the extent to which society feared. Women who dared to speak their minds. Take the case of an Askew, a Protestant martyr who lived in 16th century England. Askew was a writer and religious reformer who spoke out against the Catholic Church, particularly its views on the Eucharist. She was arrested for her beliefs and subjected to brutal torture in the Tower of London. Despite the physical abuse she endured, Askew refused to recant her views. She was eventually burned at the stake in 1546, becoming one of the first women to be executed for her religious beliefs during the reign of Henry VIII. Her defiance, even in the face of torture, was a testament to her belief in her right to speak her mind. Her execution was seen as a necessary action to silence a woman who challenged the religious orthodoxy of the time. Another case is that of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, who was executed in 1541 by King Henry VIII. Margaret was a noblewoman and a member of the royal family, and her crime was not speaking out directly, but being perceived as a threat to Henry's authority. After her family fell out of favor with the king, Margaret was accused of treason, a charge often used as a catch-all when someone was seen as a threat to the ruling power. Despite her innocence, Margaret was brutally executed by beheading. Her punishment was not just about silencing her, but about making an example of her, showing others what would happen if they dared to speak against the crown or question the king's authority. Even in the relatively more modern era, women continued to face severe consequences for speaking out. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the rise of the feminist movement, as women began to challenge the social and political order more openly. Women like Mary Wollstonecraft, the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and the suffragists, who campaigned for women's right to vote, were often met with derision and hostility. While they were not executed or burned at the stake, they faced social ostracism, ridicule, and legal challenges. Their voices were silenced through the cultural and political structures of the time, and they were often forced to operate outside the mainstream, as their ideas about gender equality were considered radical and threatening to the established order. Despite the many women who have faced punishment for speaking out, history has also shown that these punishments rarely succeed in silencing the voices of those who dare to defy authority. Women like Joan of Arc, and Askew, and Margaret Pole may have been executed for their beliefs, but their legacies have lived on, inspiring future generations of women to continue fighting for their right to speak, to lead, and to be heard. The punishments may have been meant to erase their voices, but instead, they have ensured that their messages are remembered and celebrated throughout history. For centuries, women have been intrinsically linked to the practice of healing, midwifery, and the care of the sick. In many societies, women were the primary caregivers, trusted with the knowledge passed down from generations about herbs, remedies, and childbirth. This expertise made women indispensable in their communities, yet it also placed them at great risk. The very knowledge that made women vital in their roles also became the grounds for their persecution. Over time, this knowledge, particularly when it was passed through oral traditions or practiced outside the formal structures of medicine, was associated with witchcraft and branded as dangerous. Women's traditional roles in healing and midwifery became some of the key reasons they were targeted during the witch hunts of the early modern period. What had once been seen as helpful knowledge was increasingly criminalized, and women who held this wisdom were accused of using it for dark, malicious purposes. The practice of healing through herbs, potions, and rituals was not foreign to many cultures, but as European society became more organized and structured, especially with the rise of Christianity, the role of women as healers was slowly stripped of legitimacy. In the medieval and early modern periods, medical knowledge was largely controlled by men, and institutions such as the church and the state began to centralize and regulate healthcare. Women, especially those who practiced outside these official systems, were increasingly marginalized. Many of these women were herbalists, midwives, and wise women figures who used their knowledge of nature to heal the sick, ease pain, and guide childbirth. Yet, as these women became more important to their communities, their independent roles in medicine and care made them vulnerable to the accusation of witchcraft. The criminalization of female knowledge often came hand in hand with the increasing association of women with witchcraft. Healing knowledge, once passed down in the form of family traditions, village wisdom, or folk remedies, began to be viewed with suspicion. In an era where religious orthodoxy was strictly enforced, the practice of folk medicine or the use of herbs outside the sanctioned medical establishment was seen as dangerous. Healing, traditionally a woman's domain, became a threat when it was not under the supervision of male-dominated institutions, especially the church. Women who provided these services without formal training were seen as acting outside the law of both the state and the church, and as such, they became prime targets for accusations of witchcraft. The association between women and witchcraft was also rooted in the religious and cultural view of women as inherently weaker and more susceptible to sin. In the Bible, Eve's temptation by the serpent in the Garden of Eden was often interpreted as the quintessential symbol of women's moral weakness. This concept of female inferiority, combined with the view that women were closer to nature, made them easy targets for witchcraft accusations. Midwives, who attended women during childbirth and were the bearers of female reproductive knowledge, were particularly at risk. The act of childbirth itself, seen as both a natural and mystical process, gave women significant power, particularly over life and death. Any woman who seemed to control this power was viewed as dangerous. Midwives, for instance, were often accused of witchcraft during childbirth when things went wrong if a child died, or a woman did not survive the birth. Suspicions would quickly fall on the midwife. The cultural weight of these unfortunate events was compounded by the growing influence of the church, which condemned women who did not adhere to its strict guidelines. Midwives, often women with great practical experience, but little formal education, were particularly vulnerable to accusations of practicing witchcraft or heresy. The religious and political authorities, who increasingly saw the natural world and women's power over it as a challenge to their control, began framing female knowledge as the work of the devil. What had once been life-sustaining wisdom was now cast as subversive and dangerous. Women's knowledge was not limited to healing, and many women who were accused of witchcraft had some form of wisdom or knowledge that set them apart from the rest of society. Whether it was knowledge of astrology, divination, herbalism, or folklore, women often held the keys to esoteric knowledge that was transmitted through informal means, through oral traditions, in social gatherings, or through relationships. The intimate personal nature of this knowledge, often passed down from mother to daughter, was deeply tied to women's roles as keepers of the home. It made them powerful in ways that men could not easily understand or control. Knowledge of herbs and remedies, for example, often offered women the ability to treat ailments that had no other recourse. This gave them a form of agency that was dangerous to the male-dominated power structures of the time. For these reasons, the fear of female empowerment through knowledge and speech became a significant social and political issue. Women were often accused of using their knowledge for malevolent purposes, such as causing illness, infertility, or death. The fear that women could control life through their knowledge, or use their speech to influence others, became increasingly prevalent. As the concept of witchcraft grew in both scope and social influence, those women who refused to conform to the expected social roles were accused of wielding their knowledge for dark purposes. A prime example of this is the case of Agnes Waterhouse, one of the first women in England to be executed for witchcraft during the 16th century. Agnes, a woman in her late 70s, was accused of using her knowledge of herbs and charms to cause harm to others. She was a widow, living alone, and her ability to speak with authority about the healing properties of herbs was seen as both a gift and a threat. When a series of deaths and misfortunes in her community were attributed to her, the authorities acted swiftly. Agnes was tried for witchcraft and subsequently hanged, and her knowledge of herbal remedies became part of the case against her. Her story is an example of how female knowledge was not just discredited but criminalized when it threatened the established order. Similarly, the notorious case of the Pendle Witches in England in 1612 saw a group of women, many of whom were accused of witchcraft, punished for their role in the traditional healing practices of their communities. The women were said to have caused illness and death using witchcraft, but many of the accusations stemmed from the fact that they had knowledge of herbs, charms, and other forms of folk magic that were misunderstood and feared by the authorities. In these cases, the line between legitimate healing knowledge and the accusation of witchcraft was often blurred, and the women were punished for their independent knowledge and their ability to challenge the pre-accepted norms. The association of female knowledge with witchcraft and the criminalization of that knowledge was deeply embedded in societal fears about female power. When women wielded power through their knowledge of the natural world through healing, childbearing, or even through words, they were seen as dangerous because they could not easily be controlled. This fear of women's power was not only directed at their knowledge of the physical world, but also at their ability to influence the social world through speech, persuasion, and independent thought. The fear of women's speech and knowledge was directly tied to the belief that women, in gaining control over their own knowledge, would usurp the control traditionally held by men. The fear was not just about healing or midwifery, but about women possessing any form of power, whether through speech, action, or their intimate knowledge of the world around them. In a world where women were expected to remain silent and passive, any woman who broke this mold was a challenge to the established order. Her wisdom, her voice, and her knowledge were seen as subversive forces that could undermine the power structures of both society and religion. This criminalization of female knowledge, particularly during the height of the witch hunts in the early modern period, was not an isolated phenomenon. It reflected broader societal anxieties about female power and the disruption of patriarchal control. Women's knowledge was considered a threat not only because it allowed them to control aspects of their own lives, such as health and childbirth, but because it gave them the potential to question and challenge the norms of their society. The association of women with witchcraft became a convenient way to silence these powerful voices, removing them from positions of influence and reasserting the male-dominated social order. Women's wisdom, once celebrated and essential, became something to fear. The very knowledge that had sustained communities for centuries was reinterpreted as dark, dangerous, and threatening because it empowered women to challenge the status quo from the early days of Christianity. The Church played a central role in shaping social, cultural, and political structures in Europe. Its influence extended beyond matters of faith, delving deeply into the regulation of individual behavior, gender roles, and societal norms. For centuries, the Church was not just a spiritual authority, but also a political power. In this context, women were viewed through a distinctly patriarchal lens, where their behavior and speech were heavily scrutinized and controlled. The Church's teachings reinforced traditional gender roles, often presenting women as subordinate to men, and actively suppressing their voices in both religious and secular spheres. The control of women's speech and behavior by the Church was rooted in its understanding of gender roles and religious doctrine. For centuries, the Church's teachings reinforced the idea that men were the dominant, rational force in society, while women were expected to be passive, obedient, and focused on domestic roles. Religious texts, particularly those in the Christian tradition, were frequently cited to support the belief that women's primary purpose was to serve their husbands, bear children, and uphold moral order within the home. This deeply entrenched idea of male superiority and female subjugation shaped the way women were treated, both within the Church and in society at large. One of the most significant ways that Church influenced the control of women's speech was by systematically restricting their access to education and the public sphere. Women were largely excluded from theological study, meaning that their ability to engage in religious discourse and interpretation was limited. Religious texts, which were the primary source of power and influence in medieval Europe, were written in Latin, a language that was inaccessible to most women. This prevented women from interpreting scripture independently and left them dependent on male religious authorities for their understanding of religious teachings. In a society where religious orthodoxy defined both moral behavior and social order, this exclusion from theological knowledge ensured that women remained silent, subservient, and reliant on the male-dominated Church for guidance and understanding. The role of religious texts in reinforcing patriarchal structures is evident. In many parts of the Bible, where women's roles are subordinated to men, one of the most influential passages in this regard is from the New Testament, in which the Apostle Paul writes, "Let women learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." 1 Timothy 2:11-12. This passage, and others like it, were often cited by religious leaders to justify women's exclusion from positions of authority, both in the church and in broader society. The idea that women should remain silent and subservient was central to the church's teachings, which held that women were inherently weaker, both physically and spiritually, than men. In addition to these scriptural teachings, the church also relied on theological interpretations that positioned women as spiritually inferior to men. One of the most powerful ideas that shaped Western thought about women was the story of Eve in the book of Genesis. In Christian doctrine, Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden when she ate the forbidden fruit and led Adam to do the same became a symbol of woman's inherent weakness and susceptibility to sin. Eve's actions were seen as the cause of mankind's fall from grace, and this narrative became a foundational element of the church's teachings about women. Over time, this interpretation of the fall reinforced the idea that women were inherently sinful, more vulnerable to temptation, and more easily led astray by the devil as a result. The church's teachings about women contributed to a pervasive view of women as inherently flawed and morally inferior to men. This belief was not just theological. It had real-world consequences for women. The church taught that women were more likely to fall prey to sin, and therefore needed to be closely monitored and controlled. Women's behavior, speech, and thoughts were constantly subject to the scrutiny of male religious authorities, who viewed them as potential agents of evil. The idea that women were more susceptible to sin led to a cultural obsession with controlling women's bodies and minds, and women who failed to conform to these expectations were often labeled as dangerous, unholy, or even demonic. The concept of women as agents of evil became particularly pronounced during periods of religious and social upheaval, such as the witch hunts and the Inquisition. During these times, the church viewed women's independence, sexuality, and intellectual curiosity as potential threats to the moral and social order. Women who were seen as outspoken, knowledgeable, or sexually autonomous were often accused of witchcraft, heresy, or other forms of deviance. The church's teachings about women's inherent susceptibility to sin made them particularly vulnerable. 2. Accusations of witchcraft. It was believed that women were more likely to form pacts with the devil or to engage in dark practices, making them prime targets during times of religious persecution. The church's teachings also contributed to the cultural belief that women's speech was inherently suspect. Women who spoke out or expressed opinions in public were seen as challenging the established order, and their voices were often dismissed or suppressed. The church, which held significant sway over both religious and secular law, reinforced the idea that women's speech should be limited to private, domestic spheres. Women were not allowed to preach, lead services, or participate in theological debates, as these were seen as male-dominated areas where women's presence was unwelcome. The act of a woman speaking in public, particularly on religious or moral matters, was perceived as a transgression, as it suggested that she was stepping outside the boundaries set for her by both religious and societal norms. One of the most famous examples of the church's role in silencing women can be found in the case of Joan of Arc. Joan, a young peasant girl from France, believed she was acting on divine guidance when she led French troops to victory during the 100 Years' War. However, when she was captured by the English and put on trial, her religious fervor and public role as a leader was seen as a direct challenge to the established order. Joan was accused of witchcraft and heresy, in part because she claimed to receive visions and messages from saints. Her trial was a reflection of the Church's attempt to suppress female empowerment, particularly when it came to women speaking out about their spiritual experiences. Joan's trial, conviction, and eventual execution by burning at the stake were symbolic acts of the Church's attempt to erase a woman who defied the gendered expectations of her time. The Church's teachings about women and their perceived vulnerability to sin also manifested in the broader societal understanding of women's roles in the family. The idea that women were morally weaker than men contributed to the belief that they needed male authority to guide them. Women were often seen as the property of their fathers or husbands, and their behavior was tightly controlled by male authority figures. In this system, women's voices were not just suppressed, they were entirely subordinated to male voices. The expectation that women should be silent and obedient was reinforced through both religious and legal systems, which placed women's bodies and speech under constant surveillance. The role of the Church in silencing women was not limited to the medieval and early modern periods. Even in more recent times, religious institutions have played a significant role in regulating women's voices and behavior. For example, many Christian denominations continue to restrict women from holding positions of leadership, such as preaching or leading congregations. The belief that women are spiritually inferior to men remains a powerful force in some religious communities, reinforcing the idea that women should not speak out or assume roles of authority. In many ways, the Church's teachings about women have been a means of preserving the patriarchal structures that have governed Western society for centuries. By positioning women as spiritually inferior and morally suspect, the Church helped create a cultural environment where women's voices were consistently subordinated to men's. The power of religious authority, backed by scriptural teachings and centuries of theological interpretation, was a central force in silencing women, both within the Church and in society at large. The Church's control over women's speech and behavior was not just about theology. It was about maintaining control over women's bodies, minds, and roles in society. As a result, women's voices, whether in the form of spiritual expression, intellectual curiosity, or political rebellion, were often suppressed, dismissed, or even punished. The legacy of the Church's influence over women's lives is still felt today, as many women continue to struggle for equality and autonomy within religious institutions. While some progress has been made, the enduring power of religious tradition still shapes the ways in which women's voices are heard or silenced in religious and secular spaces alike. The historical role of the Church in subjugating women serves as a powerful reminder of how deeply gendered power dynamics have shaped religious and cultural systems, and how these structures continue to affect women's ability to speak out and challenge the world around them. Throughout history, women who resisted societal expectations and fought back through their words and actions have been both heroes and martyrs. These women, whose courage and defiance transcended the oppressive norms of their time, paved the way for future generations to challenge existing power structures and demand greater rights and freedoms. The stories of these rebellious women are not just tales of resistance. They are the seeds of progress, sown by those who dared to speak up in the face of adversity. Their actions, often controversial and radical for their time, were crucial in reshaping the roles of women in both society and intellectual discourse. One of the earliest and most famous examples of rebellion through speech is that of Socrates' student Aspasia of Miletus, a woman who defied the norms of her time in ancient Greece. Although not much is known about her, Aspasia is believed to have been an intellectual equal to the men of her time, particularly within the male-dominated environment of Athenian society. Aspasia was renowned for her eloquence and her ability to engage in philosophical discussions, a privilege that was largely reserved for men. She was also the partner of Pericles, one of Athens' most famous leaders, and was known to have influenced his political ideas. Her intellectual contributions were recorded by other philosophers, such as Socrates and Xenophon, despite the fact that her speech was considered transgressive for a woman. Aspasia's life exemplified rebellion as she used her intelligence and eloquence to push against the gendered limitations of her time, though her name was largely lost in history until recent scholarship. Aspasia's example of intellectual resistance paved the way for future generations of women to demand a voice in political and philosophical debates. The suffragette movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries stands as one of the most powerful demonstrations of women fighting back through both words and actions. Figures such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton became vocal leaders in the campaign for women's right to vote in the United States, using their speeches and writings to challenge entrenched social and political systems. Susan B. Anthony's famous speech, "Is it a crime for a U.S. citizen to vote?" was delivered in 1872 after she was arrested for attempting to vote in the presidential election. Her powerful words articulated the injustice of women being denied the right to vote and laid the foundation for future movements in the United States and abroad. Similarly, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's The Woman's Bible challenged traditional interpretations of religious texts that relegated women to subservient roles, arguing for the reformation of religious and social norms. These women's bold public acts and powerful speeches changed the course of history, with their tireless activism ultimately leading to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Which granted women the right to vote. In the US, women have long fought through literature and philosophy to challenge societal norms and change the way people view gender roles, morality, and power structures. In many ways, literature and philosophy offered women an avenue to resist more quietly, but no less powerfully. One of the most important figures in this tradition was Mary Wollstonecraft, a British writer, philosopher, and advocate for women's rights, who is often considered one of the founding figures of feminist thought. In her seminal work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, Wollstonecraft boldly challenged the social norms of her time by arguing for the intellectual and educational equality of women. In an era where women were largely confined to domestic duties and denied the right to pursue formal education, Wollstonecraft's ideas were radical. She rejected the view that women were naturally inferior to men and condemned the societal practices that kept women in a state of ignorance and dependence. Wollstonecraft's work criticized the social contract of her time, which excluded women from the intellectual and political realms. She famously wrote that the education of women, like that of men, should be founded on the principles of justice and reason. Her arguments against the prevailing ideas about women's intellectual inferiority were a radical departure from the beliefs held by many philosophers of the Enlightenment era who, despite championing equality and reason, generally excluded women from the notion of universal human rights. Wollstonecraft's Vindication directly challenged these views by articulating a vision for women's liberation through education and intellectual engagement. Her work inspired future generations of feminist thinkers, writers, and activists, and it remains a foundational text in the history of feminist philosophy. Another notable female writer who used her pen as a weapon of rebellion was Simone de Beauvoir, whose book, The Second Sex, 1949, revolutionized feminist thought in the mid-20th century. In The Second Sex, de Beauvoir analyzed the way women had been historically subjugated by patriarchal society, systematically disempowered through the roles of wife, mother, and caregiver. She famously declared, "One is not born, but rather becomes." A woman, arguing that gender roles were socially constructed rather than biologically determined. Her philosophical approach to feminism questioned the essentialist views of women that had dominated Western thought, challenging both the structures of power that kept women in subordinate positions and the cultural norms that defined women's worth in relation to their roles as wives and mothers. Beauvoir's groundbreaking work provided both a philosophical framework for understanding women's oppression and a call to action for women to claim their freedom and autonomy. Her analysis of women's experiences in terms of existential philosophy and the concept of freedom resonated with generations of feminist thinkers and activists, particularly those involved in the second wave of feminism in the 1960s and 1970s. By urging women to assert their independence and define their own existence. De Beauvoir's work helped shape the modern feminist movement and inspired women to fight back against the limitations imposed on them by society. Virginia Woolf, another pivotal figure in literature, also challenged gender norms in her writing. As a central figure in the modernist literary movement, Woolf used her novels, essays, and letters to critique the social structures that relegated women to the margins of public life. In works such as A Room of One's Own, 1929, Woolf explored the necessity of financial and intellectual independence for women to create and participate in the world of literature and the arts. She argued that women, like men, required space, both literally and metaphorically, to engage in intellectual pursuits. In her famous essay, she stated, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction." Woolf's critique of the social conditions that stifled women's creative and intellectual expression made a lasting impact on feminist thought. Through her own life and writing, Woolf demonstrated that women could not only participate in, but also redefine the intellectual and artistic landscape. Wollstonecraft, de Beauvoir, and Woolf each left an indelible mark on the feminist movements of their respective times. Their rebellious ideas, expressed through their writings, not only gave voice to the struggles of women, but also provided the intellectual foundation for future generations to build upon. Their work created a ripple effect in feminist thought and activism, as their critiques of gender inequality resonated across borders and cultures. These women's words carried the power to challenge and dismantle patriarchal systems, forcing society to reconsider its long-held assumptions about women's roles, capacities, and rights. Throughout history, women have used speech and writing as tools of resistance, defying the constraints placed upon them by society and claiming space for themselves within intellectual, political, and artistic spheres. From the suffragists of the 19th century to the philosophers and writers who shaped the feminist movement, women have fought back through rebellion in thought and word. Their voices, once suppressed and dismissed, have been the driving force behind the ongoing struggle for gender equality. As their words continue to inspire and ignite change, they remain a testament to the power of rebellion through speech, an act that has the potential not only to reshape the present, but to create a new future. Over the centuries, women's voices have gradually risen from the shadows of silence to take center stage in society, politics, and culture. This evolution in how society views women speaking out can be traced through a long and often tumultuous history of social change, fueled by individual acts of courage collective movements, and transformative ideas. From the earliest rebellions, in the face of oppressive social norms, to the feminist movements that began in the 19th century, the journey toward women's liberation and the recognition of their voices has been marked by both progress and setbacks. As women have fought for their right to speak freely and assert their place in society, they have changed not only their own lives, but also the fabric of the societies they inhabit. Historically, women were systematically denied a public voice. Societal structures rooted in patriarchy cast women into subordinate roles, and their speech, whether in the family, the marketplace, or the public arena, was often silenced, dismissed, or subordinated to male authority. Women were often expected to remain quiet, obedient, and content in their domestic duties. When they did speak out, particularly on political, social, or intellectual matters, their voices were frequently deemed unwelcome or threatening. In many cultures, a woman's voice was seen as disruptive to the established order, and women who spoke out were often punished, marginalized, or silenced by legal, cultural, or religious means. This began to change in the 19th century with the rise of feminist movements that sought to challenge and dismantle the systems of oppression that kept women's voices stifled. The first wave of feminism, which gained traction in Europe and North America in the mid-1800s, focused on securing basic legal rights for women, particularly the right to vote. Women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Emmeline Pankhurst became household names as they led campaigns that fought for women's suffrage, property rights, and legal recognition as full citizens. The fight for the right to vote was pivotal in changing how women were perceived in the public sphere. The ability to vote allowed women to have a voice in the political process, and with this new political agency came the recognition of their right to speak freely about the issues that affected their lives. The suffrage movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries marked a significant shift in society's view of women speaking out, as women began to challenge the status quo, not just in terms of voting, but in broader social and political arenas. Their voices became harder to ignore. This era saw the emergence of women who used their words and actions to fight for equality. From Sojourner Truth's impassioned speeches advocating for both racial and gender equality to Virginia Woolf's essays urging women to claim intellectual independence, these women exemplified the growing power of women's voices, demonstrating that speaking out was not just about asserting individual rights, it was about reshaping society itself. The feminist movements of the 20th century further accelerated this evolution. The second wave of feminism, which began in the 1960s, focused on issues such as workplace discrimination, reproductive rights, and sexual liberation. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, 1963, ignited a firestorm of debate around the roles women were expected to play in society, particularly as housewives. Friedan's work exposed the discontent many women felt with being confined to the domestic sphere and gave voice to a growing dissatisfaction with the restrictive roles placed upon women. Women began to demand more than just the right to vote. They sought the right to participate fully in all aspects of society, from the workplace to education, from politics to the arts. Women's voices were now being heard more widely than ever before, as they began to break free of their traditional roles and speak out about their experiences, desires, and ambitions. The second wave also saw the rise of figures like Gloria Steinem, Audre Lorde, and Bell Hooks, who used their voices to challenge the dominant narratives around race, gender, and sexuality. These women were not only fighting for women's rights, but for a more inclusive definition of feminism that would include the voices of marginalized groups. The feminist movements of this time made it clear that women's voices were not just needed, they were essential for building a just society. Women began to take up space in places they had been historically excluded from, and they did so with conviction, demanding the right to speak freely and to have their voices valued. The impact of these feminist movements on women's speech cannot be overstated. By pushing for legal and societal changes, these movements helped redefine what it meant for women to speak out. Women's voices were no longer limited to the private sphere of family and home. They began to resonate in the public sphere, in boardrooms, in government chambers, in academic institutions, and in cultural institutions. The feminist movements of the 20th century created a foundation for the broader social changes that followed, from the fight for reproductive rights to the #MeToo movement. The voices of women had shifted from whispers in the dark to a powerful collective force capable of reshaping society. Yet, despite the progress that has been made, the modern-day struggle for women's rights and recognition continues. Women still face many barriers to speaking out, and the fight for gender equality is far from over. Women today, particularly those from marginalized communities, continue to grapple with systemic inequalities in every aspect of life. While women's voices are more widely accepted in certain spheres, they are still often silenced or dismissed in others. The political, economic, and social landscapes of many countries remain dominated by male perspectives, and women who speak out against the status quo are often met with resistance, hostility, or even violence. The Me Too movement that gained widespread attention in 2017 is a testament to the continuing need for women to fight for their voices to be heard. The movement, which was founded by Tarana Burke in 2006 and later went viral through social media, sought to expose the pervasive nature of sexual harassment and assault, particularly in the workplace. Women across the globe shared their stories of abuse, calling out powerful men who had long gotten away with their predatory behavior. The #MeToo movement demonstrated the power of women speaking out and how collective action could force societal change. However, it also highlighted the ongoing struggles women face in gaining recognition and justice for their experiences. In many ways, women's voices are still being silenced today, especially when it comes to issues like reproductive rights, economic equality, and sexual violence. For instance, the rollback of abortion rights in various parts of the world, including the US Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade in 2022, has made it clear that women's autonomy over their bodies and their reproductive choices is still under threat. Women's voices in these battles are critical, but they are often drowned out by political rhetoric, misinformation, and cultural stigmas. Moreover, women continue to face significant barriers in certain professions, particularly in politics and leadership roles. While there has been some progress, more women are running for office and occupying leadership positions in business, education, and government. Gender inequality persists. The gender pay gap, though narrowing in some regions, still exists, and women of color, in particular, face compounded challenges related to both race and gender. The underrepresentation of women in positions of power continues to prevent their voices from being heard at the highest levels of decision-making. Beyond formal politics, the ongoing fight for women's voices is also seen in cultural representation. Women's stories and experiences have historically been marginalized or misrepresented in media, literature, and art. though progress has been made with women now starring in films, directing, and creating television and literature that reflects their diverse experiences, there is still much work to be done in creating truly representative and inclusive media. Women are still often portrayed in stereotypical roles, and their voices are frequently filtered through male perspectives. Furthermore, women's voices on issues such as climate change, immigration, violence, and healthcare continue to be crucial. The global struggles women face in these areas, particularly women from marginalized communities, demonstrate that speaking out remains a necessary part of both social justice and global progress. Activists like Greta Thunberg in environmental movements and Malala Yousafzai in education have shown that young women today are continuing the legacy of speaking truth to power, challenging those who would suppress their voices or undermine their causes. As women continue to fight for equality, their voices remain central to the ongoing struggle for recognition, justice, and rights. While significant progress has been made in the last century, women still face systemic barriers to full participation in society, and their voices continue to be silenced in many ways. The modern-day struggle for women's rights is multifaceted, involving not only battles for legal and political equality, but also for cultural representation, social recognition, and the dismantling of deeply entrenched patriarchal systems. Yet, as history has shown, the power of women's voices to enact change is undeniable, and it is through continued resistance, advocacy, and solidarity that the fight for equality will carry on into the future. The history of women's persecution has shaped much of the current struggle for gender equality, from the witch hunts of the medieval period to the suffrage movements of the 20th century. The ways in which women have been oppressed, silenced, and marginalized have left lasting scars on society. These historical injustices have not only affected women's roles within their communities and families, but have also continued to influence their rights, opportunities, and access to power today. The legacy of this persecution is deeply embedded in social, political, and cultural structures, and its effects can still be seen in the challenges women face when they speak out for their rights, challenge authority, or demand change. The persecution of women throughout history, whether through accusations of witchcraft, the denial of political and civil rights, or the silencing of their voices in religious and academic spheres, has had a profound effect on the way women have been perceived. In society, in the past, women who spoke out against injustice or defied traditional roles were punished, often severely. The act of speaking out was frequently criminalized, with women suffering consequences such as public humiliation, imprisonment, or even execution. The public execution of women, whether through burning at the stake, hanging, or beheading, sent a clear message: women who challenged the established norms would be silenced permanently. This repression, coupled with the legal and social restrictions placed on women, reinforced the belief that women should remain passive, obedient, and silent, while men held power in the public and private spheres. Even as women began to gain more rights in the 19th and 20th centuries, the legacy of this historical persecution still impacted their ability to assert themselves in public life. While women in many parts of the world gained the right to vote, to own property, and to pursue education, the weight of centuries of silencing and marginalization continued to hinder their full participation in society. In the political sphere, women were often still seen as less competent or capable than men, and their voices were frequently dismissed or ignored. The struggle for gender equality was and still is an uphill battle, as the cultural and social Conditioning that had been ingrained for centuries made it difficult for women to claim the same rights and privileges as their male counterparts. The historical persecution of women also contributed to the ongoing challenges they face when speaking out today. Women, especially women of color, LGBTQ+ women, and those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, are often still met with resistance, hostility, and violence when they voice their opinions or advocate for their rights. The notion that women should remain silent or passive is still deeply embedded in many cultures and institutions. Women who speak out, whether in politics, business, or social justice movements, are often subjected to various forms of retaliation, from threats and harassment to professional and personal consequences. The #MeToo movement, which sought to expose sexual harassment and assault, is a powerful example of the ongoing struggles women face when they dare to speak out. Despite the successes of the movement in raising awareness, the backlash women have faced for sharing their stories underscores the long-standing challenges they face in fighting for their voices to be heard. In addition to the direct backlash, the ongoing discrimination women face can be seen in the structural barriers that prevent them from achieving true equality. While women have made significant strides in many areas such as education, workplace participation, and legal rights, there remain persistent inequalities in pay, representation in leadership positions, and access to resources. For instance, women still earn less than men in nearly every industry, and they are underrepresented in political offices and positions of power. These inequities are a direct result of centuries of cultural conditioning that placed women in subordinate roles and devalued their contributions. The idea that women's voices and perspectives are less important or less valid than men's is still pervasive in many aspects of society. In the workplace, women often face glass ceilings, which limit their ability to rise to leadership positions despite their qualifications and experience. Even as women break through barriers in education and employment, they are frequently held back by systemic biases and discriminatory practices that persist in the workplace. These barriers are often compounded for women of color who face not only gender discrimination but also racism and xenophobia. The legacy of historical persecution can still be seen in the way women's work is often undervalued. Whether it's in the unpaid labor of caregiving and domestic work, or the gendered expectations placed on women in professional environments. At the same time, the historical persecution of women has also contributed to the ways in which society responds to women's voices when they challenge the status quo. Whether it's in response to gender-based violence, abortion rights, or reproductive justice, women who speak out on these issues are often subjected to intense scrutiny, judgment, and even outright hostility. Society's tendency to discredit or dismiss women's voices, especially in sensitive or controversial matters, is a direct reflection of the centuries of repression and silencing that women have endured. The idea that women should be silent about their experiences, particularly in matters of sexuality, reproduction, or violence, is deeply ingrained in many cultural and legal systems. Even today, when women speak out against the injustices they face, they are often met with resistance or silencing tactics that prevent them from fully participating in the conversations that impact their lives. This ongoing silencing of women's voices is not limited to individual cases of harassment or discrimination. It is also reflected in legal systems and political structures that continue to disregard the needs and voices of women. For example, in many countries, laws surrounding reproductive rights from access to contraception to abortion are shaped by patriarchal ideologies that dismiss women's autonomy over their bodies. In many cases, the debate around reproductive rights centers on religious or moral objections, rather than the lived experiences of women who face the consequences of restrictive laws. The pushback against women's right to make decisions about their own bodies is a continuation of the historical persecution of women, who were once considered mere vessels for reproduction and not trusted with the authority to control their own lives. Reflecting on the legacy of this persecution is crucial in understanding the ongoing struggles women face today. It is essential to acknowledge that many of the challenges women face in the modern world are not isolated or new. They are the product of centuries of systemic oppression, social conditioning, and institutional silencing. Learning from this, history can help prevent further injustice by highlighting the need for systemic change in how women are treated and represented in society. Women's voices, once silenced, are now an integral part of the global conversation on justice, equality, and human rights. However, the fight for true equality remains ongoing. As the historical repression of women continues to influence contemporary struggles for recognition and rights, by understanding the long history of female subjugation and its lasting effects, society can take meaningful steps toward ensuring that women's voices are not only heard but also respected and valued. This involves not only challenging legal and political systems that discriminate against women, but also addressing the deep-seated cultural biases that continue to undermine women's agency and autonomy. The work of feminist movements, women's advocacy groups, and allies is critical in this ongoing struggle. By acknowledging the past and using it to inform future action, we can work toward a world in which women are no longer persecuted, silenced, or dismissed, but instead empowered to speak and act freely, without fear of retribution or marginalization. The reclaiming of women's voices has been one of the most profound and transformative shifts in modern history. For centuries, women were silenced by societal, cultural, and political forces that kept them in a subjugated position. The notion of a woman speaking out, especially in the public, political, or intellectual spheres, was often met with suspicion, hostility, or punishment. Yet, over time, women have fought back against this repression, gradually reclaiming the power of their voices. From personal experiences of resistance to large-scale movements advocating for justice and equality, modern women have shown that their voices are powerful tools for social change and empowerment. In today's world, we see a new generation of women reclaiming their right to speak out. Women are no longer content to be passive bystanders. Instead, they are standing strong and taking up space in the conversations that shape our societies. One of the most significant examples of this shift has been the rise of movements like Me Too, which has given women across the globe a platform to share their experiences of sexual harassment and assault. The movement, which gained widespread attention in 2017, began as a simple hashtag on social media but quickly turned into a global outcry against the systemic abuse of power by men in positions of authority. Tarana Burke, who founded the hashtag #MeToo movement in 2006, coined the term to provide a space for survivors of sexual violence to share their stories and find solidarity. In the years that followed, millions of women, along with some men, came forward to recount their experiences, forcing society to reckon with the deep-seated issues of sexual violence and inequality. The power of the hashtag #MeToo movement lies in its ability to amplify the voices of women who had long been silenced by shame, fear, and a culture of complicity. By reclaiming the space to speak about their experiences, women have not only called attention to individual instances of harassment and abuse, but have exposed the systemic nature of gender inequality. Women who previously felt isolated in their trauma now find themselves part of a collective voice, part of a global movement demanding change. Through social media, traditional activism, and public discourse, the #MeToo movement has allowed women to own their stories and, in doing so, reclaim a piece of their agency that had been stripped away for far too long. In politics, women have also reclaimed their voices with growing force, demanding a seat at the table in the decision-making processes that affect their lives. From local government offices to national leadership positions, women are increasingly rising to prominence and challenging the established norms that have long been dominated by men. The election of female politicians like Kamala Harris as the first female vice president of the United States, and Jacinda Ardern as the Prime Minister of New Zealand, has demonstrated the strength and potential of women in positions of power. These women, alongside others like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Nancy Pelosi, and Angela Merkel, have used their voices to bring attention to issues such as healthcare, reproductive rights, racial justice, and climate change. Their leadership represents a breaking of old barriers and a clear message that women are not just participants in democracy, they are leaders, decision makers, and change agents. Women's increasing political participation is not only changing the face of politics, but also reshaping what it means to be a leader. The Women's March of 2017, which saw millions of women across the globe gather to protest for women's rights, was another significant example of women reclaiming their voice. The march was organized in response to the inauguration of President Donald Trump, whose rhetoric and policies were seen as hostile toward women, minorities, and marginalized groups. The movement demonstrated that women's voices could unite in a powerful collective force that transcended national boundaries and challenged the political establishment. The Women's March became a platform not only for women's rights, but for broader social justice issues, from racial equality to environmental justice. It reinforced the notion that women are not just passive recipients of policy decisions. They are active agents who can organize, advocate, and demand change. This reclaiming of women's voices also extends beyond political and social movements. To encompass personal empowerment, women are increasingly stepping into leadership roles in business, academia, entertainment, and sports. Female entrepreneurs, artists, and writers are speaking out about their experiences, offering new narratives that challenge traditional gender roles and societal expectations. The #TimesUp movement, which emerged from the #MeToo movement, is another example of women standing together to fight against inequality, particularly in the entertainment industry, where women have long been subjected to discrimination, harassment, and limited opportunities. Women like Reese Witherspoon, Shonda Rhimes, and Meryl Streep have used their platforms to elevate the voices of women in Hollywood, pushing for greater representation and fairness within the industry. Through activism, creative work, and leadership, women are reshaping the cultural landscape to reflect their experiences and to promote equity in all sectors of society. The power of a woman's voice extends beyond simply being heard. It lies in the ability to influence, to change minds, to challenge the status quo, and to fight for justice. Women who dare to speak their minds often face incredible opposition, whether from those who seek to silence them, from entrenched cultural norms, or from political forces that prefer the status quo. Yet, despite the obstacles, women continue to speak out, to advocate, to fight for what they believe in, and to inspire others to do the same. Women like Malala Yousafzai, who survived an assassination attempt by the Taliban and continues to advocate for girls' education worldwide, are living examples of the power of a woman's voice to transcend boundaries and make a global impact. Her voice, once silenced by violence, is now a symbol of resilience, strength, and the transformative power of education. The importance of speaking up for justice, equality, and freedom cannot be overstated. The history of women's oppression, silencing, and marginalization demonstrates just how critical it is for women to claim their voice and use it for social change. The fight for women's rights is not just about achieving legal equality, about creating a culture in which women's experiences are heard, validated, and respected. Women speaking out for justice are not only challenging existing power structures, they are creating space for future generations to live in a world where their voices are valued. In the age of social media, women's voices have reached new heights, allowing them to influence global conversations, mobilize social movements, and advocate for policies that affect millions of lives. As women reclaim their voices, they are also reshaping the narrative about women's roles in society. No longer are women's stories confined to the margins of history. They are now leading conversations, writing their own stories, and demanding that their voices be included in every arena. This shift represents a fundamental change in how society views women, not as passive observers, but as active participants in shaping the future. The strength and impact of a woman's voice are immeasurable. And as more women continue to speak up, the world will become a more just, equitable, and inclusive place for all. Through the power of speech, women continue to fight for their rights, for freedom, and for the dignity that has long been denied to them. Their voices are not only reclaiming space for themselves, but for all those who have been silenced for far too long. From the earliest days of recorded history, women's voices have been silenced, dismissed, and marginalized, whether through religious and cultural oppression, societal expectations, or legal restrictions. Women have long been denied the right to speak freely and assert their place in the world. Yet, despite the immense cost, whether through punishment, persecution, or personal sacrifice, women have found ways to break the silence. Their defiance, their courage, and their resilience have led to the gradual reclaiming of their voices, not just for themselves, but for future generations. The journey from silence to voice has been paved with struggle. From the suffragists who fought for the right to vote, to the women of the feminist movements who challenged oppressive gender norms, to the countless women who dared to speak out against injustice in their everyday lives, each step forward has come at a high price. Many women have faced violence, rejection, or even death for the simple act of speaking their minds. Yet, the voices of these women continue to resonate, inspiring the movements of today and driving the ongoing fight for equality and justice. As we reflect on the legacy of these courageous women, we are reminded of the profound impact their words and actions have had in shaping the world we live in today. The stories of women who fought for their voices to be heard continue to inspire us to stand up for what is right, to challenge the status quo, and to believe in the power of our own voices. Their bravery and resilience remind us that we are never powerless, and that change is possible when we find the courage to speak up. As you reflect on the journey from silence to voice, consider the value of your own voice. Whether it is through standing up for others, sharing your own story, or speaking out against injustice, each of us has the power to make a difference. Your voice matters. It is a force for change, a beacon of hope, and a tool for creating a more just and equitable world. If you found this video inspiring, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Join us in continuing the conversation, and let's keep amplifying the voices that are making a difference in the world. Thank you for watching, and remember, your voice is powerful. Don't be afraid to use it.